Hello, and welcome back to Dissatisfied Philosophy. Today I'm going to be introducing my new Substack account by reading an article that I recently published at the end of August. So this Substack is going to be dedicated to specifically academic work on the New Testament, Gnosticism, early Christianity in general. The series that I began last week, which we are not going to be reviewing here, but it is probably going to be pretty common. It's going to be a series where I review recent articles and books in those fields of study and kind of give my thoughts on them and just kind of break them down, reviewing their contents and giving some critiques as well. So that people who do not have the time or do not have the education to read these, very high-level scholarship works, they can instead read my Substack post and get all the main ideas and have something to think about and be caught up on the cutting edge of New Testament scholarship. But today, I'm going to be reading my article published on August 29th, 2025, titled On Jesus and Mary's Physical Appearances. And then I put as a subtitle, If It Be Right to Call Him a Man, which is from Josephus. Was Jesus, not Zacchaeus, called short? That is, T elikia miklos, in Luke 19:3. If so, this would be the only straightforward description of Jesus' physical appearance in the New Testament and, basically, the entire extended library of New Testament Apocrypha. This is the case that Isaac Soon has recently made in a 2023 article. Although this post is not concerned with evaluating his argument, I will critically examine his argument in a forthcoming journal article. Here, I assume neutrality. This possible instance aside, the number of descriptions for Jesus' physical appearance across the history of Christianity remains sparse. As Robin Faith Walsh writes, quote, although we are not given a description of his physical appearance in the Gospels, he is depicted as an underdog from a lower class of society and of few means, unquote. The best we get about Jesus' appearance in the Gospels is when he is dressed in a purple robe and a crown of thorns is placed on his head. Readers imagine a tortured, mocked, and humiliated man. Anyone who wants more is left unsatisfied. This is very odd. Jesus' disciples were with him for 3 years. Many people saw Jesus as he traveled across Judea preaching the good news, and those people presumably told others who told others who told others, and yet none of what they said about his appearance made his way into the earliest writings of Christians. Individuals who, at least in the case of Luke, claim to rely on eyewitness accounts of those closest to the source. Individuals who, if they were attempting to write standard Greco-Roman biographies, as many scholars used to hold, likely would have included information throughout about the depiction of Jesus, as physical characterization was so crucial in grasping the dimensions of a figure's actions. This is in contrast to ancient novels. These rarely describe the physical characteristics of their characters, and are, at least in this instance, a better genre to situate the Gospels, but this is also an insufficient genre for other reasons. At numerous points in the Gospels, the evangelists clearly attempt to draw a lineage from Jesus to figures like Moses by presenting actions that Moses did as similar to those that Jesus did. Yet while a description of Moses, at least as a baby, is in the Bible, there is no physical description of Jesus as a baby or as an adult. Philo goes so far as to say that Moses was the most perfect of all humans, a young, divinely inclined man. However, this was a typical depiction of Moses in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE, fitting Hellenistic motifs. It was not based on any historically known information about his appearance. The evangelists seem to be fully compelled for other reasons to describe Jesus if they had any idea what he looked like. Many factors suggest that they did not. While it is true that they were likely ignorant of his description, on the other hand, the evangelists repeatedly describe aspects of Jesus' life that they were in reality unaware of. So their ignorance of Jesus' appearance is not a justifiable reason for not describing his looks, nor is the claim that he was so ugly or so handsome, as either could easily be put forward for theological purposes. An ugly Jesus is the best representation of the universal anthropos, distinguished in no way so as to make him stand out in the crowd, and so be held by all as a minister to the poor and downtrodden. An attractive Jesus could be used to precisely draw that Mosaic or Davidian connection. As both figures were described as handsome, everyone wants an attractive, quote, King of Kings, unquote, rather than an unattractive one. So again, the mystery remains. This in turn briefly leads to apocryphal sources. The Gospel of Thomas, likely compiled in the mid-2nd century, has Matthew say to Jesus that he is a, quote, philosopher, unquote, But then has Thomas, the most illuminated of all of Jesus' pupils, retort that he does not have the words to describe Jesus' appearance. The author certainly does not want the reader siding with Matthew, which means that, unlike a philosopher, Jesus didn't have beard and wear long robes, according to Thomas. In a deeply apophatic manner, the author invites the reader to affirm Thomas's proclamation, describing Jesus as impossible due to the holiness of his appearance. As the author then tells off Peter for claiming Jesus as an angel, clearly the appearance of angels is still too debased to describe Jesus. Another 2nd century text, the Acts of Peter, adopts a similar apophatic approach, with Peter stating that Jesus is, quote, great and small, unquote. Then there's, finally, perhaps the first precise instance of Jesus' appearance, a bald youth. This comes in the late 2nd century text, the Acts of John. While the description may appear straightforward, after second thought, it is evident that the contradictory oddity of this description is the entire point. Jesus' appearance is indescribable. So it is for the litany of other descriptions this author gives. And so it is for all other texts in the Gnostic milieu, e.g. the Apocryphon of John. Once again, we are left with nothing concrete. Perhaps patristic sources shed more light on Jesus' appearance. Reported by Origen, Celsus, the 2nd century philosopher, called Jesus, quote, ugly and small, unquote. But this doesn't appear to be necessarily trustworthy, because the anti-Christian Celsus has every reason to depict Jesus in what, in his mind, is an unflattering way, even if this description in fact comes from Christians themselves. On the other hand, statements about the suffering servant did lead the 2nd century Justin Martyr to likewise see Jesus as being distinguishably unattractive. So there's an inherent likelihood. So also Celsus prefaces this description with, quote, as they say, unquote, which I guess could be os phemi in Greek, which he often used to report Christian accounts. And so, in the end, this may all support Soon's case for Jesus being historically short if his linguistic argument for 1903 is successful. Justin's line here, likely and directly, has led to much debate in scholarship over Tertullian's claim in the early 3rd century that Jesus was not handsome. However, Taylor notes that this extremity seems to have been created because, for Tertullian, Jesus' resurrected form was so much greater. For theological purposes, then, Tertullian exaggerates to draw a sharper contrast between Jesus' two forms. Before this, Clement of Alexandria adopted a similar line. Origen's response, then, to Celsus that Jesus was actually extremely attractive should be seen as little more than refuting something that disparaged his Savior on the tongue of an opponent. There is no reason to think that Origen has a trustworthy source to claim this, as he then posits what may be called a polymorphic Christology to account for his speculation. That is, Jesus appears in many different ways to many different people depending on their circumstances. Augustine of Hippo would later rebuke this line of approach in the 4th century, arguing that Jesus must have had one single appearance. Yet even with all this theological reasoning propelling a depiction of an ugly Jesus, there is less theological reasoning propelling the depiction of a Jesus with plain features, perhaps lightish skin, and indistinguishable from a large crowd in either a positive or negative fashion. Analyzing gospel episodes with the plainness of Jesus in mind, rather than an ugly or attractive Jesus, may be a fruitful hermeneutic for future studies. Almost certainly, all later depictions of Jesus after the 3rd century lack any shred of historical credence, as any sources, oral or written, that would have included information about Jesus were lost to the annals of history. While they offer little else in the way of historical attestation, they may well be viewed in a spiritual light that emphasizes how all sorts of people have imagined Jesus throughout time and place to convey the necessary wisdom needed for that time and place. Take, for instance, the image of Jesus on the Shroud of Turin, which was likely a medieval artistic creation meant for local piety. Although everything points to this cloth dating no earlier than the 13th century, as was recognized by the local bishop of Troyes, Pierre de Assis, in 1389, from a spiritual lens, perhaps this does speak to something about the resurrection, and therefore about Jesus' description on earth, a man with a beard and long hair. At the very least, this description would match that of Celsus, as is so often said, God works in mysterious ways, or here, God reveals things in mysterious ways. The faithful Christian is left to decide the cosmic significance of this medieval forgery. And then there's, for a more recent example, the appearance of Jesus to the Orthodox monk and Saint Paisios of Mount Athos in the 20th century. For Paisios, Jesus appeared to him as a man with blue eyes. The cosmic significance of this is once again left up to the faithful. This is the case with many other appearances of Jesus through the centuries. From a historical and spiritual perspective, Jesus is labon and homeomati anthropon, that is, taking in the likeness of man. The contradictions in reports and testimonies, when viewed through an apophatic lens, such as that preached by Origen and several Gnostic authors, are the greatest proof of Jesus' indescribable existence. Rather than adopt a docetic attitude in light of this, the Christian is instead compelled to retain their acceptance of the decisions of the ecumenical councils and canons while holding on to that shred of unknowability that was first paradoxically revealed in the Transfiguration. It is here that Jesus first revealed that his description is a paradox. But this was only to the pillars of the church, Peter, John, and James. The cosmos only came to know this through his death and resurrection. The descriptions of Jesus' resurrection are wholly contradictory if brought together across the Gospels and Paul, not to mention how they are suffused with standard Greco-Roman motifs about divine beings rising from the dead. And even so, the paradoxes that run through them and their narrative progenitors point toward a divine truth paradoxical like that of the Trinity itself, the Trinity being the three-in-one God. It should come as no surprise that the same holds true for his mother, Mary the Theotokos, or God-bearer. Mary both partakes in the life of the Trinity while remaining ontologically separate. It is she who has given Jesus his flesh on earth, and she who has fastened his bones. Despite this, physical descriptions of Mary are even more scarce than those of Jesus and early Christianity. There is nothing in the New Testament or early Christian Apocrypha. To my knowledge, the first lengthy description originates from the 4th century, as recorded by Epiphanius of Salamis, and is repeated by the 13th century Eastern Church historian Nikephoros Kallistos. This report is seen as the received account of Holy Tradition in the Orthodox Church today. Epiphanios describes Mary as having golden hair, being of average height of most women, with bright eyes and a pronounced nose. Although there were few, if any, independent, other textual descriptions available at this time, artistic representations of Mary were becoming increasingly common. In the 1920s, a team of Yale archaeologists discovered a 2nd century mural under a Syrian church that depicts a woman standing over a well that is either the earliest image of Mary as a painting of the Annunciation, or it is of the Samaritan woman at the well. Based on common 2nd century descriptions of Mary standing over a well and drawing water out of it with a pitcher of the Annunciation, Michael Peppard argues that the context of this painting best suits it as a portrayal of Mary. In any case, hardly any particular physical features are present. All that can be said is that the figure is a woman with long hair. An image painted on the walls of the Catacombs of Priscilla, located in Rome, was drawn in the 3rd century. Here, Mary is portrayed holding an infant Jesus. She has long hair and dark features, although it's unclear whether these dark features are intentional or simply a result of the artist needing to differentiate the image from the backdrop of the catacombs. To consider Epiphanius' report in conjunction with these artistic depictions leaves a glaring contradiction. For Epiphanius, Mary has long golden hair. For these artistic depictions, Mary appears to have long brown hair. Mary having long hair, hardly anything specific, is the most secure fact to be drawn about her historical appearance. Other artistic depictions of Mary follow in the 4th, 5th, and especially the 6th century onward, but these offer little in the realm of historical credence. On the other hand, the relative lacuna and textual mentions of Mary's historical appearance extends even unto the 6th and 7th centuries. In one statement, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, an anonymous Eastern Christian who presented himself as Dionysius from Acts 17 by discussing conversations with 1st century Christians as if he were present, writes that Mary's, quote, entire appearance, unquote, testifies to her being the Theotokos, or God-bearer. He does not describe any details. Toward the end of his 2nd homily on the Dormition, the theologian John of Damascus offers a detailed description of Mary's character, but does not write a word on her physical appearance. In all of John's Dormition homilies, he does not comment on her appearance, despite taking the liberty to consciously construct an imaginative narrative about what Mary's last days on earth may have been like. Perhaps this motivation was theologically driven, and spurred by the recognition that describing Mary is a form of debasement, which may also explain Pseudo-Dionysius' omission. Yet finally, in a text dating back to around the 8th or 9th century, there is another lengthy description of Mary. Epiphanius the monk describes Mary as having a fair complexion like wheat, triceti coloros eret, blonde hair, dark eyebrows, and a straight nose, with all her features exemplifying her divine grace, or specie plena. Other than its agreement with Epiphanius of Salamis' description of Mary's hair color and nose shape, and its agreement with Pseudo-Dionysius that Mary's appearance speaks to her divine presence, what prompted the rest of this 8th or 9th century description of Mary is unknown, as certainly no sort of relevant historical documents on her appearance were present by this point in Christian history. Such a description would roughly correspond to the woman Epiphanius knew in the areas he lived, perhaps even his own mother. If the latter, then this is a profoundly spiritual reading of Mary's characteristics. By applying his own mother's characteristics to Mary, the motherly archetype herself, he has situated his mother and Mary in a beautiful flow of divine communion and participation. Other instances of Mary's physical appearance may then be noted in her alleged apparitions. Sometime in the 16th century in Guadalupe, Mexico, devotion began due to the belief that Mary appeared to a farmer named Juan Diego and had given him an image of herself, replete with many Aztec symbols. In this image, Mary appears as an indigenous-looking woman with parted brown hair, a prominent nose, and fair skin. After appearing, conversion rates supposedly increased, as Aztec individuals were now more secure that their culture and cult would not be usurped by adopting Christianity. In 1879, in Knock, Ireland, Mary appeared to the Irish at a time when comfort and peace were desperately needed, as the Irish people were still enduring difficult times in their homeland. She brought that peace and comfort to a downtrodden people, appearing as an Irish-looking woman with long hair, fair skin, and a crown upon her head. In the East, apparitions are less commonly reported. When they are reported, they are often attributed to a Marian icon rather than a vision of Mary bringing a message or revelation to people, but that isn't always the case. In 1903, a picture was taken at Mount Athos that is allegedly the first known photograph of a Marian apparition. The figure, who is thought to be Mary, resembles a woman straight out of an Orthodox icon of Mary, complete with a Byzantine-style cloak, folding her hands in prayer. In agreement with Nikephoros, she is fair-skinned and of average height. Whoever this figure is, it is not a man. Since no women are allowed in Mount Athos, despite this rule being broken numerous times, the alternative options may be limited for those so inclined toward Marian piety. Then there's the very famous Coptic Orthodox apparition of Zaytun, Egypt, which lasted for 3 years from 1968 to 1967. Much has been written about this apparition, and the evidence for its occurrence is stronger than that for any other miracle in Christian history, including even the resurrection of Jesus according to Dale Allison. In the most clear photographs and most trustworthy testimonies, Mary appears to be wearing Byzantine garb and standing in prayer. It is impossible to determine any specific facial features, skin color, or other physical descriptors. With these faux historical and faith-based apparition descriptions, it is evident that drawing any specific conclusions about Mary's appearance is beyond the reach of the historical method, except for the fact that she had long brown hair and fair skin like her son Jesus. But the theological implications are clear. Like Jesus, who is, to wax Hegelian, the universal anthropos, and paradoxically the theos anir, the divine male in his particularity, Mary is the universal anthropos in her indescribability, and guni, the woman in her particularity. Mary is at once the archetype of all women and the archetype of all men, as Mariology is analogical Christology, and Christology is analogical anthropology. And yet she is the perfect woman, as she is the perfect mother for women on this side of the eschaton. In other words, Mariology is anthropology when thought at the eschatological horizon. Just as Mary is beyond death in flesh, joyfully participating in, yet ontologically separate from the Trinity, so shall all humans be in the eschaton. For now, Mary's anthropon physis is that what sustains her role as mediator between creation and the Trinity. Exemplifying the Holy Spirit now, as she was the instantiation of the Holy Spirit in her earthly life, she receives prayers and even comes down to creation out of her pure humility to aid in the salvation economy of difficult times. As Sergius Bulgakov writes, she stands at this middle point, but in due time all shall take this middle point. And then that middle point shall no longer be a middle point with anything below it, but instead the ongoing and continuous movement of humans growing infinitely more like God as they pass from, quote, glory to glory, unquote. Mary is a foretaste, a first fruit, of the resurrection that awaits all, while she, like Jesus, had physical features that are largely unknown to us today, and historically impossible to reconstruct fully. This is all the more reason to embrace an apophatic and polymorphic approach to Christology, and so, also, at least in Mary's exalted heavenly state, which I've argued before should be conceptualized within a Hegelian framework, Mariology. In addition to dogmatic theological reasons for accepting a polymorphic approach to appearances, there are also pastoral, ecclesial, and iconographic reasons, the latter of which I have discussed. And here is I'm not going to read these out, but here are these sources. With that said, I thank everyone for listening to this. Definitely go ahead and subscribe to my Substack. Again, this is free to view. Many of my other articles will not be free to view, and many of them right now are not free to view. So I think it's $6 a month. You're going to be getting weekly, uploads. You're going to be getting thoughtful writings. These are not just cranked out, over 30 minutes. These are thoughtful writings that take a day or more to complete. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments on this writing and on the other writings on my Substack, and I highly advise you to go over there because that is where I'm going to be doing most scholarly work outside of journal publications. So thank you, and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, I suppose, and have a nice day.